Hello, YouTube and denizens of the internet. It's just your average gamer here with another Thoughts On episode. This time, we're going to talk about another game studio that's working its way back into the goodwill of the gamers, Bethesda. So, I'm sure most people are familiar with Bethesda Game Studios, but for those that aren't, Bethesda is a world-renowned developer, most famously known for its Elder Scrolls series of open-world first-person fantasy RPGs. Yeah, I mean, pretty much everybody and their grandmother plays Skyrim, so chances are you have as well, and you're well aware of Bethesda Game Studios and what they provide is in regards to the gaming industry. And for a good decade, in the early 2000s, from, around Morrowind's release, which I believe was 2002 until about 2011 or the end of 2011 when Skyrim came out, Bethesda, alongside BioWare, were the, premier RPG developers, at least Western RPG developers in the industry. And they were both, at their peak in that time. BioWare focusing more on the story-driven, choice and consequence type RPGs, whereas Bethesda, focused more on the open-world sandbox, play as you want kind of RPGs. And yeah, after Skyrim came out in 2011, Bethesda was, on top of the world. I mean, this is a game that's been released on literally every platform you can think of, and even some you probably didn't think of. However, the last 10 years, we'll be we're approaching the 10-year anniversary of Skyrim, and to say the last 10 years have not been nearly as successful for Bethesda compared to the previous to the 10 years leading up to Skyrim, would be an understatement. In those early 2000s, Bethesda released Morrowind, Oblivion, Fallout 3, and Skyrim, all in I think it was actually not even 10 years, like a 9-year window. All considered classics of the industry and the genre. Some, in Skyrim especially, an industry-defining release, really. And so what has Bethesda done since then? Well, and I should specify I'm talking about Bethesda Game Studios specifically, because Bethesda also has through ZeniMax as a publishing arm. So we're not considering those other games that come out under the Bethesda umbrella, like Doom and Arcane and games from Arcane Studios and so on and so forth. This is my thoughts on Bethesda Game Studios. The guys who work with Todd Howard and his projects. And so how have things been for Bethesda over the last 10 years since Skyrim's release? Well, they've been, not great. For the first half of the decade, they were riding the coattails of the Skyrim's success. But then a critical year came in 2015. 2015 was a notable year for many reasons, one of which was Witcher 3, which I believe its success plays a part in Bethesda's decline, because The Witcher 3 came out a few months before Bethesda's game of 2015, Fallout 4. And Fallout 4, no, not nearly the same kind of disaster as, let's say, Mass Effect 3 or more recently Cyberpunk 2077. It was certainly you could argue the weakest launch or the weakest game Bethesda has released, at least since the Morrowind, at least pre-Morrowind days. So what went wrong with Fallout 4? A few things. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about it because this isn't a Fallout 4 video. This is a Bethesda Game Studios video. But Fallout 4 is really as of now, the center point of this discussion, because it's it's the main thing we have to go on as far as their future. So Fallout 4 gets announced at E3 2015, and it blows the world away. It was the highlight of E3 that year by far. It showed off settlement building systems, refined combat systems compared to previous Fallout games. And then perhaps most shockingly was the very near release date. It was announced in June and it released, I believe it was November of that year. But when the game released, it quickly became clear that while it certainly was going to sell well and be a financial success for the company, that it was not a game on the same level as Bethesda's previous game, Skyrim, and arguably any of its other previous games, going as far back as to Morrowind, and even the first few Elder Scrolls games. Although it's hard to compare those games to current games, given how vastly different the industry is now. But all that being said, Fallout 4 came out, and while it sold well and was certainly popular among certain circles of gamers, it definitely left a bitter taste in the mouth of many fans of both the Fallout franchise and just Bethesda game studios in general. And why was this? Well, it was for a couple reasons, but the best way to sum it up is that they moved away from what they did well, and they tried to do what other companies do well. For what reason, it's hard to say. Maybe they just wanted to try something different. Maybe they felt this would be a more appealing, broader idea of a game to draw people in. Whatever the reasons, they tried things differently. The main things they tried differently was they scaled back heavily, I'd argue, on overall RPG elements. I think that's the core of the issue, is they really scaled back the RPG elements. And this isn't necessarily like a shocking statement, because if you track the history of their games, each subsequent game, you can argue, loses a bit as far as RPG elements. Skyrim is an amazing game, but compared to Oblivion and Morrowind, it has less features. It doesn't have spell crafting. It got rid of acrobatics and athletics as skills. Its guilds and quest lines were less fleshed out. A lot of things. Skyrim benefits a lot from the modding community, probably more so than any other Bethesda game. But that's not to take anything away from base vanilla Skyrim. It's still a great game. It streamlined and simplified a lot of stuff, but it retained enough to still be a very enjoyable RPG experience, even if it was a little more streamlined compared to the previous entries. But what Skyrim still had that Fallout 4 doesn't was that freedom to really play how you want. Bethesda Games Studios and their games, from whether it's the Elder Scrolls or Fallout 3, have been defined by their open world sandbox and the idea of I lost my train of thought. Yes, and the idea that you can play however you want. So in Skyrim, you could be a wild barbarian Nord with dual-wielding axes and cutting people apart, or you can be a sneaky Argonian or a Khajiit archer, or you could be a hoity-toity high elf mage. And certainly from a gameplay perspective, and even from a role-playing perspective, those offered vastly different experiences. The way you interacted with people, and although the game let you do everything on one character, if you really want to embrace the RP element, you can make your mage character be the one that does the College Winterhold, and then leave the Thieves Guild for a different character. And ultimately you can have vastly different experiences across the board with your characters. And on top of that, there's had a decent storyline, amazing world to explore, all that. So where did Fallout 4 go wrong in comparison to that? Because it's just saying that they toned back on the RPG elements as far as like skills and leveling up and stuff is, it's not a radical statement, because it's continuing the trend that the studio had, been following for a decade at that point. And so what was the main difference with Fallout 4? And I think the main thing that betrayed it wasn't just that it streamlined some of its mechanics compared to Fallout 3 and other Bethesda games. It's that it fundamentally changed the type of game it was trying to be. Because you see, what Fallout 4 did that had never been done in any other Bethesda Game Studios game was make you a more or less predetermined character. In Skyrim, you're just a dude who wakes up on a cart heading for execution. Everything that happens before that is entirely up to your imagination, and everything that happens after that is entirely based on your actions. Oblivion, similar deal. You're you're in jail. Your past is entirely up to your imagination, and your future is entirely dependent on your actions. Although guided, both games guided by the main story. You're still a hero, but that's really secondary. The being the Dragonborn in Skyrim, as important as that sounds, and it's secondary to just being someone living in Skyrim. And from being in Fallout 3 or in Oblivion, in Oblivion, you're you're just some prisoner in an Imperial jail cell, and you become the hero of Kvatch and all that. But it's still more about the life you live in Cyrodiil as opposed to the big actions you take in support of what's his name, Martin Septim. Fallout 3, to be fair, did have a much more predetermined backstory because you literally saw your whole life before your eyes. But it still worked a bit more because while it took away a bit of the imagination as far as your past, it still let you just be what you want in the capital wasteland, and it allowed you to deal with your father however you want it. You could love him, hate him for what he did and all that. The problem is, in Fallout 4, it not only does it give you a hard backstory, like you were alive before the war, you're there when the bombs drop, you have a family, all this stuff. Not only does it give you that hard backstory, but it also pins you to that backstory going forward. And what I mean by that is not just that you have a story and you have to carry it out, because like being the Dragonborn or the hero Kvatch, blah, blah, blah. It's that not only is there that, but it's clearly railroading you to a certain way. So what do I mean by that? So let's take, you have, in Fallout 3, you have your dad, who's the person you're looking for when you go out. And in Fallout 4, you have your son, who's the person your son, who's the person you're looking for as you venture out into the world. The main difference is, with your father, when you meet him, you can react to him and his actions in any way you see fit, really. Whereas in Fallout 4, you're kind of shoehorned into caring about your child. And I know what you're thinking, oh, well, what kind of monster wouldn't care about his child? Well, like this kind of monster. Because look, Fallout is a post-apocalyptic wasteland. And I mostly play games, when I play games with a morality system, I tend to lean good. Certainly for first playthroughs. But Fallout has always brought out the darker side of me, because you live in this horrible post-apocalyptic world. Like, there's very little room to be really good, and it's just a lot of fun to be bad, especially in that circumstance. I mean, when I first played Fallout 3, within the first few hours, I had forced my childhood Billy to watch his mother get eaten by radroaches, then killed him, and then I left the vault that I had spent my entire life in, found the first settlement I came across, realized it had a bomb in the middle of it, then got offered to blow up that bomb and did it without blinking an eye. Like, there's nothing like that. There's no story like that in Fallout 4, because the story is you're trying to find your son, and you're forced to care about him. And the thing that really encapsulates this for me is there's one scene where you're talking to Nick Valentine, and you're talking about your son, and there's a certain thing he says, and you have an opportunity to pick your dialogue choice, but there's no like, oh, I don't care about my son, let's just go kill some super mutants. It's like, I'm gonna cry now because my son's missing. And it's like, okay, that is probably the case for most people in this circumstance, but Bethesda games and Fallout games and Elder Scrolls games are about being what you want to be in this world, and really just having that freedom to play it how you want, whether it's good, bad, sneaky, aggressive, whatever it is. And Fallout 4 took that away, because not only did it define your history, it defined your future, and you were just kind of along for the ride. It really tried to turn itself into a narrative RPG, which Bethesda has never been a studio designing narrative RPGs. It's actually, I don't know how much influence they took from it, given how close the release dates were, but it's actually kind of astonishing the similarities between it and Witcher 3 in regards to some of its story ideas. As The Witcher 3's whole, like in Fallout 4, your main story is to find your son. In Witcher 3, the main story is to find your adoptive daughter Ciri. And so you think, okay, well, why is it such a bad thing to Fallout does this? Well, it's because Witcher 3 is a narrative RPG. It's what it's advertised as. It's what the franchise always was. You're playing as a predetermined character from the start, from the first, the second, the third game. It's an unofficial sequel to the series of books by Andrei Sapkowski, and if you're buying this game, you're going in knowing this, and you're buying into this narrative, and you're embracing that this is a narrative RPG. But Fallout 4 and Bethesda Game Studios have never been the narrative RPG studio. They've always been the open world sandbox studio. And so when they did this shift, it rubbed me and a lot of Fallout and Bethesda studio fans the wrong way, because it took away so much of the charm of those games, so much of the freedom and the ability to do as you please that makes them so appealing. The reason why Skyrim has such a broad appeal is because it's of that promise that you can go into this world and like really pretty much do whatever you want without feeling beholden to certain story beats or certain ideals or certain character flaws or perks or whatever. Like, it's really just a blank slate version of yourself you're putting in this world, and yes, okay, you're the Dragonborn or whatever, but that's so minor. It's so backfield in comparison to everything else the game has to offer, whereas in Fallout 4 they brought that main story to the forefront and tried to force you to care about it, and it just didn't work, because for two reasons. One, it's not what people expected from a Fallout game. It's not what people buy these Fallout games for, or the Bethesda Game Studio games for. But two, and perhaps more importantly, and this is what I hope Bethesda realizes as well, is it just wasn't good. It wasn't you never buy into it. And again, that could just be because of your expectations of the franchise and a game from that studio, but you never buy into it. At least I never did. I'm sure maybe some people have. But for me, like, especially compared to The Witcher 3, it's like, this is like a fifth grader's interpretation of The Witcher 3's story in a post-apocalyptic setting. I mean, not really, but you know what I'm saying. Like, they tried to show that they had the same strengths as a company like CD Projekt Red or old BioWare, but they don't. That's not their strength. It never was. Their strength is world building, lore, and open world shenanigans. They're not core writers. And it's not to say that the writers are bad. Like, obviously there's a lot of really great quest lines and characters in these games, but as far as like a main core narrative, it's not their strength. It's not what they do. It doesn't compute well. Whew, I'm kind of rambling some random words there. Sorry. Let me bring it in. Essentially what I'm saying is Bethesda tried something with Fallout 4 and it failed because it's not their strength, and because it would probably never could have succeeded, because even if the story was good or in the same ballpark as The Witcher or even just a bit below it, it still would have had the trouble of overcoming the expectations that this game wasn't going to be like this, that this game was going to be what Bethesda Game Studio games have always been. It was doomed to fail from the start. And I'm not saying it was a bad idea to try something new, but I'm saying it was poorly executed and they sacrificed way too much of what makes their games great for this experiment. You really lose a lot of the RPG elements. You lose a lot of the ability to kind of role play different characters because you're forced into this story and this caring of your child. So that's, so that put, people on notice that, Bethesda has made a misstep. It's not even so much that they made a bad game, because it's not a bad game. It's bad relative to its own expectations and the history of the franchise it's a part of, but it's still a decent game. The problem was it was a betrayal of what Bethesda Game Studios games are all about. And made a bit arrogant by this still success of the game, they decided to double down on doing things that aren't their strength. And again, I'm all for experimenting and trying new things in the gaming industry. We desperately need that. But I think in this case, it just didn't work. It didn't work in Fallout 4, and by God, it didn't work in Fallout 76. I'm not going to get into that too much because this video is already 20 minutes, and that 76 is a whole discussion in of itself. But it would be fair to say that also was a bit of a disaster. To put it really quickly, it took, it further took the few things left that still made Fallout 4 decent, and it took those out and doubled down on the things that we didn't really want. Turning into more just like a basic shoot. Anyways, I'm not here to rant about 76. All that to say is that Bethesda is at a pretty crucial point in its history, because for the first 10 years of the new millennium, they were on the top of the world, at least in regards to open world sandbox RPGs. No question about it. No one can deny it. Even if you don't like all their games, chances are if you played Morrowind, Oblivion, Fallout 3, and Skyrim, well, at least one of those games you'll fall in love with. And so the question is, going forward, what does this mean for the company? And what does this mean for their future games? And what I hope it means, and what I hope that Bethesda realizes, is that, all right, we put our hands into some foreign waters here, tried some things, and by and large, they didn't work. Sure, Fallout 4 was a financial success, but that was much like with Cyberpunk, based off just the hype and the fandom that had already existed for the company and for the franchise. But now we're getting their next game, Starfield, which apparently is going to release this year, probably in a very similar style to Fallout 4, with a summer announcement and a late fall, early winter release. And this is a pivotal moment for Bethesda Game Studios, because they have, not nearly tarnished their image to the same level as CD Projekt Red, but they've certainly made a lot of their fans wary of what their next games are really going to be like. If it continues the trends, if Starfield continues the trend set by Fallout 4 of being more of a streamlined, one way to play, shoehorn story kind of open world adventure, then I think Starfield's going to fail. Financially, it'll be fine, but for people like me, it's going to be a disappointment, and could signal the beginning of the end for Bethesda Game Studios, or depending on how you look at it, could finalize what was the beginning of the end with Fallout 4 and say, okay, well, that studio is gone now. So what does Bethesda need to do with Starfield to regain their lost prestige, to regain their lost ground? Well, it's simple. It really is simple. They just need to go back to what worked. They tried to innovate, and I love them for it, but they failed. And if they just try to shoehorn their innovation, these new approaches even further, it's going to backfire. Because as much as innovation is important, if you have something you're really good at, and people love you for it, and they want more of it, just give the people what they want. And what we want from Bethesda games is an open world sandbox with the blank slate character, to roleplay to my heart's content, to be as good or as bad as I want to be, to play in a variety of different ways, whether it's between magic and swords in Skyrim, or energy weapons and regular guns in Fallout. I don't know how all that will translate to a game like Starfield, since we really don't know much about it. But they really need to go back to their roots. They need to embrace what made Skyrim and all the games that came before it so great. And believe me, I'm all for more narrative RPGs out there, because that's my bread and butter. But Fallout, that's not your thing. It's not your thing, and there's no shame in that. You don't have to make the next Witcher. Fallout 4 didn't need to be the Witcher 3 with guns. And Starfield certainly doesn't need to be the Witcher 3 in space, or anything like that. What it needs to be is Skyrim. Is Skyrim in space. It really needs to I really hope they took some time to reflect on what went wrong and what went right with Fallout 4. And I really hope Todd Howard and his guys realize what they're good at and what they're not good at. Because, man, if they just focus all in on what they're good at, which is, world building, exploration, open RPG elements, all that stuff. With the technology available now, with all the innovations that have been made in RPGs and open world games in the 10 years since Skyrim, like, they can really make something truly spectacular. And I just really hope they have the sense to do so, because I really believe that if they double down on some of the ideas of Fallout 4, if they really double down on the idea of a central defining narrative being the centerpiece of the game as opposed to the backdrop, if they really double down on streamlining the combat experience to make maybe a smoother experience with less diversity and all that stuff, then I really think if Starfield ends up being that kind of a game, then I think it will be the end of Bethesda Game Studios. I don't think they're there yet. One bad core game and one really messy spin-off idea isn't enough to sink a company that has produced so many good games. You know, with BioWare, it was a lot more than just Mass Effect 3 that buried them, And I definitely believe Bethesda can regain its crown, so to speak, and regain its prestige if it does the right thing with Starfield. And Starfield is a really important game, and because not only will it kind of, or will it be, important to see, of itself what kind of game it is, and not only will how it's received have a great influence on the company forward, but more importantly, at least for a lot of us, is Starfield will give us an insight, not just to what Bethesda Game Studios prioritizes in game development now, but by extension of that, it will give us insight into the game we're all really waiting for, and that's The Elder Scrolls 6. A game that's going to have immense hype because it's the follow-up to Skyrim. But if Starfield fails, if Starfield is another Fallout 4, I think that will really hurt Skyrim, Elder Scrolls 6. And will make me really worried that the Elder Scrolls 6 is going to be to the Elder Scrolls what Fallout 4 was to the Fallout franchise. And I really, a few months ago I said there's no way they'll be that stupid as to double down on these things, because sure, Fallout 4 was a financial success, but people are more wary now, especially after all the bullshit they got up to with 76, that if this game has a lot of the similar problems, then at least in my eyes, that'll signify to me that the old Bethesda is truly gone. That Todd Howard and his crew are either incapable or unwilling to make the kinds of games they used to make. And that'll be sad, because there are so many, more streamlined, narrative-focused, open world or otherwise RPGs. Not just The Witcher 3, but you can even look at like the modern Assassin's Creed games like Ghost of Tsushima, like that market of narrative-focused, open-world, streamlined-ish RPGs is quite saturated right now. What we really need right now is another game like Skyrim that's just open and free and just your imagination runs wild. And I really like to think that Todd Howard and the guys at Bethesda recognize this, because it doesn't just make sense to revert back to what they were good at from just on the surface of it, of like, okay, well, this is your strength, why not? But even from a business perspective, like, the industry is starved for a true Bethesda style RPG, because even other games that have kind of taken inspiration from it, or and some such, like, let's say The Outer Worlds, it's still more narrative focused, because that's kind of more of Obsidian's strength. Even Fallout New Vegas, it was barely the same kind of open world, and it was more narrative focused, but it was still an open-ended narrative that still allowed you to interact with it completely how you want. You weren't emotionally trapped into caring about a certain character or whatever. You still had, you could kill everybody if you wanted in New Vegas, pretty much, But Bethesda has always been good at that open world, that freedom, that imagination inspiring game. They've always been better at just providing the playground and letting the players and the modders fill in the blanks. And I really, really hope that they recognize that and that they go back to that with Starfield. Because then who knows how great Starfield could be if they take that route. And then, but more importantly than that, as much as Starfield interests me and maybe will become something I love, my vision is set further down the field to Elder Scrolls 6. And if Starfield comes out and it's more Fallout 4 than Fallout 3, my hopes for Elder Scrolls 6 will plummet. But if Starfield comes out and it's more, Fallout 3 than Fallout 4, then my hopes will go up, and will give me hope again that this studio won't go the way of BioWare and won't follow the path that CD Projekt Red has started to descend upon into obscurity and disappointment. Bethesda's in a critical point because they still have enough goodwill that they can salvage what they've lost if Starfield delivers. If it doesn't, they'll obviously still get a lot of hype, and a lot of people will say, okay, well, Starfield was another experiment because it's a new IP, blah, 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 blah. And we'll really have to see what it's like before I can really say, because Starfield can come out and be bad, but still maybe give me hope depending on the design choices. And maybe they just don't, because maybe they'll embrace the design choices of their older games, but maybe it just doesn't quite work in the setting they're creating. Because, how do you make a truly open world sandbox space game unless you're going really ambitious like No Man's Sky? But I don't know that they can do that without sacrificing too much in the process. So it won't be like a definitive window into what to expect from Elder Scrolls 6. But it will still be very telling as to where the mindset of the studio is in regards to what they want to do and how they're doing it. So yeah, I hope Starfield comes out this year, because I'd be thrilled to just see some of it and to really just know whether or not I can hold out hope that Bethesda is still Bethesda. All right. Well, those are my rambling thoughts on those are your average gamer's rambling thoughts on Bethesda Game Studios. And just to wrap up, summarize, they've made some mistakes, they've lost some goodwill. I'm worried about their future, but unlike some other companies that have, perhaps buried themselves beyond redemption, like BioWare and maybe even CD Projekt Red, I think Bethesda, their catastrophe was minor in comparison to what Mass Effect 3 and Cyberpunk 2077 were to their respective studios. They did a lot of damage. Fallout 4 did a lot of damage, and 76 did a hell of a lot of damage, but not so much that they can't recover from it. And whether or not they've recovered from it will become apparent in Starfield. So, be on the lookout. I'll be talking a lot about Starfield when we get any more information on it. Like I said, there's been rumors of a summer reveal kind of around the E3 window. It probably won't be an E3 this year because COVID is still going to be a thing, but we should certainly see some of it in the summer. And I'm excited to see. Anyways, I intended these types of videos to be a little shorter than this, but what can I say? I start rambling, I can sort of stop. But I will stop here. These are my thoughts on Bethesda Game Studios. And until next time, stay average.